good afternoon. Very warm welcome to this week's Think Global, in which we're going to do a deep dive into the recent commission series in the BMJ called US COVID-19 Lessons for Future Health Protection and Preparedness. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Gavin Yamey. I'm the Heimowitz Professor of Global Health here at the Duke Global Health Institute, where I direct the Center for Policy Impacting Global Health, and I'm a Professor of Public Policy over at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I have the very great privilege of being one of two guest editors for this series, and I'm delighted that the other guest editor, my co-conspirator, Dr. Ana Diez Roux, is joining us today, I believe from Buenos Aires. Indeed.
That's right.
I will do intros in a second. As today's moderator, let me take the liberty of very briefly setting the scene. During the devastating COVID pandemic, worst pandemic in 100 years, one nation stood out, the United States, which saw eye-wateringly high death rates compared with its peer nation. 1.2 million Americans killed by COVID. That is 16% of global deaths in a country with just 4% of the world population. 1 in 3 Americans knows someone who died of COVID. About 300,000 children are estimated to have lost one or both parents. And while there continues to be a debate and much discussion on the exact prevalence of long COVID, there is no doubt the burden is substantial. The question then for today is, why was the US response so catastrophically awful? And answering that question isn't about assigning blame. There is plenty to go around. And it's not, Lord help us, about rehashing kind of culture wars around things like masking. We really have to learn lessons from failures. It's crucial if we want to prevent another 1 million deaths in the next pandemic, and just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, if we want to improve and protect US population health more broadly. So it's those lessons we're going to examine today, learning from the past to create a better future. For this BMJ series, we commissioned 5, I believe, extraordinary, compelling, powerful, in-depth policy analysis papers. And I'm really delighted that we were able to get the lead authors of all 5 papers as panelists today. But before we hear from the 5 lead authors of the 5 analysis papers, I want to ask 2 of my colleagues to give 2-minute opening reflections. Ana Diez Roux, Distinguished University Professor of Epidemiology, Director of the Urban Health Collaborative, and the former Dean of the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. And then Dr. Jocelyn Clark, who is the BMJ's International Editor and an Adjunct Professor of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Anna, over to you first.
Thank you so much, Gavin, and thank you everyone, and especially the lead authors for joining us today. I just want to highlight 3 big themes that Gavin and I thought about as we put together this series, and that I think you will see beautifully reflected in the comments that we'll hear from our speakers. And these will be no surprise to you, I think, but I think is still worth highlighting. The first theme, I think, is to really, make visible and discuss how pre-existing, I'll call them systemic and structural features of the US society really affected, in ways that were in many ways completely predictable, who got COVID and how they fared when they got it. Because this is so important to understanding not only what happened during COVID and how we can prevent the same thing from repeating itself again in a predictable way in the next pandemic, but also for addressing other fundamental health challenges in the United States, health and health equity challenges. The second theme has to do with discussing and problematizing, in some ways, what was a a really remarkable failure to respond. Despite all the richness and all the wealth in the US system. I mean, many of us came to the US because of the outstanding academic institutions in public health, for example, just to give one example, or many of the resources that the US has. And yet there was a remarkable failure to leverage and deploy all that expertise, all those resources. There were exceptions, of course, but I think it's worth thinking about why that happened. And what that means also for the future. And lastly, I think a third theme was to also highlight perhaps things that happened or that were done during the pandemic that were unexpected, but that had positive impacts. And how we, in some cases, were able to do things that no one thought the US would ever do. Like the moratorium on evictions, to give one example, for example. And so I think thinking about what that means for what is possible, what is really possible if we take these challenges seriously, not just, again, to prevent the next pandemic, but also to advance, improve health and health equity in the US generally. So those are the three themes, and I'm sure you'll hear them in the presentations today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Anna. And Cameron Abbasi, editor-in-chief of BMJ, noted that the two guest editors with this series on the US were an Argentinian and a Brit, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. Jocelyn.
Thank you so much. And the lead editor, a Canadian. So here I am coming to you from the BMJ's offices in London, England. As a very international journal, and I want to thank on behalf of the entire team at the BMJ, Gavin and Anna are two exceptional guest editors, and I want to thank all of the authors who made this series possible and contributed so much of their time and energy. It's wonderful to see many of you here today, and I look forward to the discussion. We'd like to thank Duke University and Michael Penn as well for helping organize this event, and I'm sure we'll have a very thoughtful and engaging discussion today. So the BMJ series, 5 analysis articles, 3 opinions, an editorial, all freely available and collected on bmj.com/US-COVID-series. Please share with your networks and read and comment on these papers for us. Our intention at the BMJ was not to be comprehensive about America's response to COVID-19. There have been so many retrospectives already, including on the uniqueness of the American situation that Gavin shared with us from the top. But what we were able to offer were 2 things. One, the view from an international medical journal. Of course, a healthy America, a healthy COVID response in the US benefits us all globally. Secondly, a reflection. We took a deep dive into very specific curated topics that we believe draw very important lessons, particularly in a post-pandemic period where the instinct is to just move beyond the pandemic, go back to what we thought was normal. And yet there are so many challenges and opportunities to improve health and protection, but also rising insecurity, rising economic and social crises, and rising misinformation and divisiveness. We believe as a journal that there are lessons here to be drawn, health to be used as a tool for protection, for accountability, and for the future. And we're so grateful to all of those people who contributed commission papers to this series. They are relevant now to this election year in America, to the future health crises that Anna was just telling us about. They deserve to be documented. We're really proud of this series and thank everyone. Look forward to today's discussion. Thanks, Gavin. Over.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. So let's dig into those 5 policy analysis papers. We've asked each lead author to give a brief spark talk, 5 minutes max. Anna and I recorded 1-minute videos on each paper. We were able to summarize the message in a minute. So 5 minutes is a luxury, I reckon. Key findings, messages, take-home lessons. First up is Dr. Keisha Bentley-Edwards, Associate Director of Research for the Samuel Dubois Cook Center on Social Equity, Associate Professor at Duke University School of Medicine, Co-Director of the Duke Clinical and Translational Science Awards, integrating special populations core incentive for equity in research. Dr. Bentley-Edwards and colleagues' analysis is on race, racism, and COVID-19 in the US, lessons not learned. Keisha, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Gavin, thank you so much for the invitation for this event, but also for the broader series. I'll go ahead and jump in because I know that the clock is running. So when we did this, we had done some, especially over at the Cook Center, we'd already written in real time about COVID and these pre-existing conditions. And this was a wonderful exercise to reflect back, to think about, well, what did we get right and what could be done better? And what we started off with was these myths, right? And I think it's an underlying theme in general right now, as far as these myths of Black peculiarity. And so the idea came out at first that Black people may be immune because they're not testing positive, but really it's a problem of the accessibility of the initial test. And then there was this myth that we're all in the same boat and we're in this together. But as disparate outcomes started to become apparent, it became very clear that we were all not in the same boat. And a lot of this had to do with with the pre-existing conditions. Now, often in the media, there was a big point of pointing to pre-existing conditions on an individual level. Perspective to explain disparities. So in some ways, making it seem as though it was individual irresponsibility or ignoring health coming back to bite you, your personal health. But what it did is that it also exposed, as you started to scratch the surface, the systemic racism and racial capitalism that expose particularly racialized minorities. And these are Black, Latino, Indigenous, and especially Pacific Islander people to disparate conditions and health risk. So it's not just that I have a pre-existing condition, but what are the things that happen at the state and local government that allows access to equitable care to be existent or non-existent in your community, healthy foods, and accessibility to everything from childcare, employment, and safe housing. All of these things have an impact on our health. And these things are also included to historical policies like redlining, the GI bills from World War II that affect intergenerational wealth, and even conversations about reparations. And so with that in mind, it's not just about looking at how there are disparate outcomes based off of race. It's really about the disparate outcomes based off of racism. And that really is an underlying theme. These disparities that we're seeing mimic what we see in other treatable conditions like hypertension, heart disease, kidney disease, these things that are highly treatable, we saw them in COVID, and particularly once COVID became somewhat treatable, that these disparities looked a lot like what we see in other chronic conditions. And so what you find is that this genetic perspective, it starts to fall apart, especially once you start thinking about the ways things are treated, the way people are listened to or not. And so both the historical policies as well as contemporary actions and perspectives. And so we know in the framing of COVID-19 as being an elderly person's disease, it missed the point that there are, that for people of color, you found premature mortality happening at a much higher rate for those who were under 65. And then because I can start, and I know I'm at the last.
You have a golden minute.
Yeah, my last point is my recommendation talking points. And that is one of the benefits that came out of the COVID response was community partnerships. And we still need to have those community partnerships and recognize that communities do know their own strengths and how to approach things. But also we need to rethink the way vaccines are distributed. We need to disaggregate racialized data so that way we know that we are giving proper care to the people who need it most. And I will stop there because I'm sure the Q&A, I'll be able to start talking your ear off again. Thank you so much.
So much. And there's a sentence from your extraordinary paper on how there can be no reckoning for the US COVID response without a reckoning on racism in the US. And the recommendations that Dr. Bentley Edwards and colleagues lay out in their paper are extraordinary. Next up is Dr. Mary Bassett, who served as New York State's Health Commissioner for 13 months during the pandemic. Dr. Bassett is director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights and is the FXB Professor of the Practice of Health and Human Rights in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Bassett's paper with Dr. Jocelyn Feldman is called U.S. Public Health After COVID-19, Learning from the Failures of the Hollow State and Racial Capitalism. Mary, over to you.
Thanks very much, Gavin. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Keisha, for that elegant and rapid summary. It was my state job as health commissioner that really was the origin of my interest in the paper that Justin Feldman and I contributed to this series. I arrived to find a department that was doing its level best to retool from a department that mostly just awarded contracts and monitored them to one that did things, ran vaccination centers, testing, contact tracing, and so on. So there were many wonderful people working very hard, but the hollowing out of the department was unmissable. As you've heard, the US lost far too many people during COVID, and the losses were borne very unequally throughout. We talk a lot about the chronic underfunding of public health, about the difficulty explaining what we do in public health and making what we do visible. But in this paper, we conclude that while, and I quote, starving health department budgets is harmful, it is a symptom of the more fundamental problem of political divestment from state capacity. Government public health had been kneecapped long before COVID. And the narrowing of government's role is often justified by the idea that the wrong people benefit from taxpayer dollars disproportionately. And by wrong people, I mean Black people, people of color. You can take a look at the privatization of everything by Donald Cohen and Alan McKellen. Government shrinks, its regulatory authorities ceded to private entities that are often answerable to shareholders and not the public. So fixing this is not just a matter of bigger budgets and crisper communication. We saw huge outflows and huge impact of an aggressive government role during the pandemic, but that flow of funding is now receding and the fundamental challenges remain the same. So we saw what government can do. I hope that that remains something that stays with all of us, have childhood poverty, suspended evictions, but it's clear that we need an ideological shift that sees government as a transformative force and not just one that outsources to the private sector and cuts checks. So we suggest in the paper that two manifestations are amenable to action: the rise of management consultants and the reliance on a model of scientific research funding that draws principally on investigator-initiated research and has weakened government research institutions. And there's a book by Mazzucati and Collington titled The Big Con, which talks about this $900 billion global industry in management consultants that continues to grow, various scandals notwithstanding. With COVID, these names showed up. McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Deloitte, they all stepped in at federal, state, and local health department level, billing literally hundreds of millions of dollars, although we need some investigative journalists to find out exactly how much money was spent, because these often aren't readily available figures. So the consultants typically aren't expert in public health, they're not publicly accountable, and their work may not be publicly available. The expertise, experience, and capacity of government public health is undermined and not rebuilt. And big societal issues, ones that have been highlighted by Keisha, structural racism, are unlikely to be addressed by a bunch of management consultants. Very smart people, by the way, but these are societal priorities. So we also focus on how scientific research priorities are formulated and funded. Perhaps somewhat ironically, Operation Warp Speed was an example of how government can take aggressive action, in this case to develop in record time a highly effective vaccine. The government set the goal, funded and facilitated it through the private sector, but clearly setting parameters, and government scientists contributed key parts of what enabled the emergence of the mRNA vaccine. But typically, government funding for scientific research flows to private entities that endorse the idea that it's the imagination of the individual investigator that leads to scientific investment, even though the list of innovation by government scientists is very long. What I've seen in my work and as a government public health worker is the endless cutting of public science and the ricketiness of public health surveillance, even as we outsource more and more of the expertise that should be within government. So these are areas that we suggest in the paper are ones in which we could focus on in the immediate term, but as my time is up, we'll leave the rest for the discussion.
Thanks so much. And when Dr. Bassett and Dr. Feldman's paper first arrived, I have to say, this point about investigator-driven research, I kind of struggled with a bit. I'm like, investigator-driven research is the glittering jewel of America, extramural funding from the NIH, but it's absolutely right. This model, as the authors say, has sidelined social needs and separated researchers and those working in public agencies. And it's not well coordinated for a pandemic. It was a little bit of a kind of who could just race to get their study out first. So in that sense, it was also not fit for purpose. Thanks so much, Mary. Now we're going to turn to COVID and the workplace. We have Dr. David Michaels, who is an epidemiologist and professor at the George Washington University School of Public Health. In the Barack Obama administration, he was Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In the Bill Clinton administration, he was Assistant Secretary of Energy for Environment, Safety, and Health. Dr. Michaels and colleagues' analysis is on US workers during COVID-19, uneven risks, inadequate protections, and predictable consequences. David, over to you.
Great, thank you, Gavin. First, I'd like to thank all the editors of this powerful series and the opportunity to be a member of this illustrious group. Early in the pandemic, especially before we had the vaccine, we relied on frontline workers to ensure that society and the economy continued to function. We depended on workers to care for the sick, the elderly, the institutionalized, to make sure food was harvested, processed, and delivered to stores, and to run our first response correctional and transportation systems. Many of these workers were underpaid, they were disproportionately Black or brown, many were immigrants. Initially, we provide subsidies to workers who lost their jobs that were often more generous than the wages paid to many workers who continued to work outside their homes. Federal policies impacting workplace exposures were developed to protect the supply chain of food or other vital products or prevent staff shortages at healthcare facilities rather than to protect frontline workers from virus exposure. Some employers, with the support and encouragement of elected officials, put production and profits ahead of worker safety. The federal government did not insist that employers adequately protect workers who could not work at home, who had come into work and risk exposure, and too many of those workers paid for that with their lives. There's compelling evidence that early workplace outbreaks, especially in meatpacking, helped the pandemic spread rapidly in rural areas that otherwise were spared. Workers gave the virus to family members who brought to schools and elsewhere in their communities. During the pandemic, it became clear that wage inequality, housing segregation, and lack of employer-provided benefits all meant that vulnerable workers were at elevated risk for disease and death. As Ana noted at the beginning, unprecedented government interventions through cash assistance, tax credits, increased healthcare insurance coverage, and other steps did improve the lives of workers and their families. The lapse of these programs has led to increased inequality and poverty. These policies and programs would be beneficial even in the absence of a pandemic, and we shouldn't wait for the next pandemic to institutionalize them. But the failure to prioritize stopping workplace exposure meant relatively little data was collected on workplace cases or deaths, so we don't actually have adequate statistics on the disparate impact of the virus on different occupational groups. But some things are clear. First, at the beginning of the pandemic, many healthcare and long-term care workers were killed. Many were sickened. Outbreaks and other studies soon identified other industries where workers were at higher risk of death and illness, including food and agriculture, transportation, logistics, manufacturing, and prisons, activities where work had to be done in person, not on Zoom. This was not the inevitable consequence of the appearance of a new lethal virus. The federal government could have insisted that employers implement better workplace protections. So here's a thought experiment. Imagine if there were no Zoom, no telework, and all the CEOs and highly paid politically powerful executives in finance and tech and professors like me actually had to come into the office every day. We would have seen a national clamoring for stronger rules to protect workers at work. Instead, the government mostly just ignored what was going on in American workplaces. So what can we do? We need smarter, stronger worker protection regulations. OSHA, the agency I ran during President Obama's administration, needs to issue a rule covering airborne pathogens, along with a rule on pandemic preparedness. We need to prepare for the next pandemic long before it arrives. We need national legislation requiring and for small employers supporting adequate paid medical leave so sick workers can stay home and not spread the virus to coworkers and the public. As a nation, we need to focus on clean air in workplaces, but also schools and nursing homes, indoor locations where people spend many hours at a time. When we turn on the faucet in our sink at home, we expect the water to be clean and not contain anything that can make us sick. We should have the same expectation of the air we breathe.
1 minute.
To get there, we need to change local building codes requiring improved ventilation and air filtration, and not just for airborne infections. Wildfire smoke and particulate pollution impacts indoor and outdoor workers in every part of the country. We have to have a national effort to support developing, stockpiling, and distributing respirators designed to fit and protect more people more comfortably for longer periods of time. And finally, we need better coordination between worker safety and public health systems. For more on that, I recommend a new piece in the American Journal of Public Health, also written with my collaborator on this piece, Dr. Greg Wagner of Harvard. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing your wisdom. I think there are so many moral disgraces of this pandemic. Perhaps the most disgraceful is the failure to protect essential workers. And it still blows my mind that the US does not have federal sick pay. We have got to figure that out. We're going to talk now about prisons, jails, ICE detention centers, juvenile detention centers. Dr. Lauren Brinkley Rubenstein is an associate professor here at Duke in the Department of Population Health Sciences. She's a national expert on examining how the criminal legal system impacts people, families, and communities. And during the pandemic, I presume she's going to talk about it, she co-founded an extraordinary project, the COVID Prison Project. a national data project that tracked and analyzed COVID testing, cases, and deaths in prison systems nationwide. Dr. Brinkley Rubenstein and colleagues' paper is on COVID-19 in US jails and prisons, implications for the next public health crisis, including, of course, the climate crisis. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm really glad to be here, and it's really nice to see some familiar faces on the Zoom as well. That's right. We founded the COVID Prison Project, which was one of the only national aggregators of the scope of COVID-19 in prisons and jails across the country. And anyone who does this work really knows that there's so much opacity. It's very difficult to understand what is happening inside of jails and prisons, what healthcare provision looks like, what the scope of disease might be. And so we found ourselves in this unprecedented moment where we had national news reports almost every day about what was happening in prisons. Throughout the course of the pandemic, we saw that the most of the largest single site cluster outbreaks were in prisons and jails across the country. The New York Times had a whole team of journalists that was hired just to report on carceral facilities, which to this, I still really can't wrap my brain around. Of course, they've all been laid off at this point, which in some point gives us a little bit of a pathway to where my talk is going to end, and that is that we really have returned to the status quo. To set the scene, why are prisons and jails such risky settings? It's a couple of reasons. One, people who are incarcerated tend to be more sick at baseline. On average, people who are incarcerated have at least 2 chronic health conditions, and that really intersects with conditions of confinement that are really a perfect storm for large-scale outbreaks. Overcrowded facilities at baseline. Most prisons at the start of the pandemic were at 104% capacity, so more people than should be there were there, and a lack of access in many ways to routine healthcare. And so we saw, like I said before, a perfect storm. It became in some ways this moment in time where the public paid attention to what was happening in carceral facilities like they had never before. Those of us who do this work really knew that, there's this clear connection between community health and carceral health. And for the first time, you really could map it. And people were talking about it in a way that felt really important and critical. And that is that you could look at and see the association between outbreaks inside of prisons and jails and the corresponding outbreaks that might happen as people were released or as staff went home to those neighboring communities. However, I think, like I said before, much of the progress that I feel like we made on reporting, almost all prisons launched dashboards where they were updating daily data on the number of cases, number of deaths. So we saw this access to data, a new understanding of what was happening in ways that had never happened before. So we really thought, oh, there's going to be more transparency, things are going to change, and that really didn't happen. What we've actually seen is more restriction and a quote unquote staffing shortage that has resulted as really as a part of the impact of COVID-19. And so lots and lots of more limiting of information or of access to these spaces. And so in our paper, what we call on is really the importance of understanding what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in carceral facilities and to people who were in the carceral system, and how we didn't learn the lessons, but we should really in the context of climate change. This is really an emerging field. There's not that much that's happening looking at the intersection of carceral spaces and environmental justice. However, there's some important papers that have come out that have really tried to show that we are not prepared to handle the climate crisis. Most facilities lack air conditioning. They're still overcrowded on average. And we also see that emergency management plans at the state level often don't consider people who are incarcerated as a part of those plans. So what happens when a cell floods? we really don't know. But most of the management plans that we see really look at protection of buildings or the provision of labor among people who are incarcerated. And so what we really say in our papers, what should we do about it? There ought to be more data transparency. Congress did introduce the COVID-19 and Corrections Data Transparency Act in 2020, and our team really weighed in on that. However, it was unsuccessful and didn't pass. And so I think that we need more transparency, we need more data mandating, and that data should really be available in real time on a whole host of health-related data. And then, as always, you know, the biggest way to mitigate the impact of incarceration on people's health is to reduce the population. And so I think decarceration has to be an option, reduction in the number of people who come into contact with carceral settings. And yeah, I've got lots of overlap, I'll just say, between everyone else who's talked. I mean, it all sort of centers in this population, right? Racism, structural determinants of health, workforce. And so I'd love to talk about those overlaps later.
Absolutely. The overlap between the 5 papers is extraordinary. Lauren and colleagues' paper is extraordinary, and she summarizes some of the research on carceral settings and climate change, extreme heat linked with increases in suicide watch incidents, increased all-cause mortality, and increases in incidents of extreme violence. But very quickly, on a personal note, one of the issues I got involved with myself was in decarceration with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Justice Collaborative and others, and I wrote about this issue, and anyone who could bear to listen to me, I went on TV, on radio, and so on. One very tragic, very upsetting impact of that was that when I came back to my office after having been working at home for a while, when I opened my door, there was a pile of mail for me. And I was like, what is this? And it was mail from relatives saying, my dad is in jail, he has diabetes, I'm worried he's going to die, can you do something about it? Letter after letter after letter. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And obviously, in most cases, I couldn't. There was one person in a Durham jail, and what we were able to get to the mayor to, expedite that person's release. But what were we doing? I mean, absolutely horrific response. And finally, we're going to turn to the law as a tool, as a lever for public health improvement. Dr. Michelle Mello is a professor of law and professor of health policy at Stanford University. She is a leading empirical health law scholar whose research is focused on understanding the effects of law and regulation on healthcare delivery and population health outcomes. She holds a joint appointment at the Stanford University School of Medicine in the Department of Health Policy. Dr. Mello and colleagues' paper is on legal infrastructure for pandemic response, lessons not learned in the US. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. This is joint work with colleagues at Temple University Center for Public Health Law Research and trainees here at Stanford Law School, and it was generously supported by the Commonwealth Fund, for which I'm very grateful. In our paper, we make 2 major findings. One is that the pandemic revealed weaknesses in the US's legal infrastructure for emergency response. And by legal infrastructure, I mean the web of federal, state, and local laws that empower public health officials and also constrain the actions that they are able to take, for example, to protect individual civil rights and civil liberties. And our second finding, unfortunately, is that legal reforms that were adopted during the pandemic by state legislatures mostly made that problem worse. So, to the first point, when we looked at the US response to understand how law served as a structural determinant of the outcomes that we encountered, 3 things really stood out that surfaced during the pandemic. First is the simple fact that nothing in the US Constitution or any statutes, any legislature passed laws, requires officials to take action to protect public health. And that's true whether it's an emergency or every day. And so what we saw is officials free to do nothing. The federal response, of course, as we've already talked about, was delayed and anemic. State and local officials, too, often delayed action or made ill-considered policy choices, and some ended the interventions that they did eventually impose far too soon. There's nothing legally wrong with that. And that is a core challenge that those who wanted a more robust response faced in trying to press for it. Second, when the federal government did eventually attempt to mount a vigorous response, it found itself hemmed in by the courts. The Supreme Court sharply limited the federal agency's ability to take various actions to promote public health, saying Congress needed to state more clearly that it had intended to delegate that power to agencies. So to David's point about OSHA, the Supreme Court weighs in a case called NFIB versus OSHA as saying that COVID is not a workplace hazard as defined in the Occupational Health and Safety and Health Act, and so OSHA may not impose a vaccination mandate. And third, we found that state emergency powers laws proved inadequate to meet the challenges of a global multi-year pandemic. These laws were mostly modernized after 9/11. What the drafters had in mind was an acute, short-term, localized emergency like a bioterrorist attack. They're not purpose-built for example, confining large groups of people for extended periods of time. And at the same time, even after modernization around 2003, a lot of them contained inadequate checks on the powers that were exercised. So they sort of had the problem of being both too generous and not generous enough. So we concluded that this legal infrastructure set the conditions for governmental responses to be fragmented, inadequate in some cases, potentially overheavy in other cases. It also set the conditions for public backlash. So it set up a problem that was twofold that needed fixing. We needed to impose some additional accountability mechanisms to quiet potential backlash and build trust. And we also needed to empower public health officials to do things they weren't able to do during COVID. Only one aspect of the problem got fixing though. And that was the restriction on perceived overzealousness in exercises of public health powers in some predominantly red states. So to turn to my second point, the legal reforms that we saw during the pandemic mostly have made the problem worse. My team identified 65 laws passed in 24 states during the pandemic period that imposed restrictions on officials' ability to impose community mitigation measures, vaccination, masks, etc., that lasted beyond the pandemic period. And these laws fell into two categories. The first were substantive restrictions on officials' ability to institute particular community mitigation measures. So to draw out some of the points in this slide here, 4 states adopted new restrictions on requiring vaccination or proof of vaccination. 7 restricted officials' ability to close businesses. 4 to close schools. 6 barred or limited mask mandates. 11 restricted the authority to limit the activities of religious organizations, and so on. And the second type of laws were procedural moves. As shown in this table, these reforms tightened the time limits that health officials had or governors had to impose community mitigation orders or alter the processes for extending or changing them in ways that made it harder to maintain them over a lengthy pandemic. And some of these involve legislatures to such an extent that it really compromises emergency response. For example, in Florida now, the governor and the health officials lose control over emergency responses in 1 week. That is when the legislature has to be ready to take over and manage pandemic response. And I'm guessing that Dr. Bassett would have some skepticism about a legislature's ability to do so swiftly, functionally, and effectively during a pandemic. And she certainly would not be alone in that. So we've got some real endemic problems with public health legal infrastructure. It has set us up for pandemic responses that are very inequitable because a lot of these reforms are a matter of state law. So again, we've taken pre-existing social determinants and through our actions during the pandemic, exacerbated them, making it even more difficult, in my view, to make a better and more effective and more equitable response to the next pandemic.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks to all the panelists for keeping to time. We've got about 20 minutes of questions. Those are really powerful spark talks, really great summaries. And I want to open it up. I've got a million questions, but I've talked too much. So I'm going to open it up to the audience and including the audience online. In fact, let's go to the audience online because they always get forgotten.
Oh, yes. So far, top question is...
and I'll read it out again so that folks can hear.
Okay, wonderful. The top question is around from everyone's talks today, what emerges most clearly are structural pre-existing inequities in the
Yes.
political system. So it's clear that, it's critical that we turn to changes in our roles and delve more deeply into what changes need to be made, but we're not
Yes.
doing them.
Right.
Why aren't we doing them as well? What
Brilliant question. I mean, it's the very first thing that Anna said. It's something that Lauren raised. Everybody's paper talked about pre-existing structural systemic problems and barriers, structural racism. How do we think about this, and how do we move forward? What do we prioritize? How are we going to change this? What have been the barriers to change? That's a huge set of questions, but we'd love your reflections on this. Maybe we'll just start with you, Keisha.
Sure. This system, sometimes people get very overwhelmed when they think about systems, and they think about it as being like the Supreme Court. And I'm not on the Supreme Court, you may have noticed, but our system.
One day.
Our systems are everywhere, right? And whether they're at your academic institution, whether you're involved in politics, or if you're collaborating with your local county government, public health. And so I think that if you think about systems as this big social problem, which it is, but it's also local. And even when we're talking about federal policy, is implemented on the local level. So what are we doing at the local level in that implementation that you may have contact with? And I think that's one way to look at it. So at your academic institution, your public health institutions that you have access to, and start working with those systems that you have control over, and then don't do it alone.
Yeah. Mary.
Obviously, we have a very big problem. And what our paper we tried to highlight is that that if we view government as a tool of social transformation, which it has been, right? We in the past, not always equal, but nonetheless transformative, then we have to stop this endless attack on the ability of government to do its job. It doesn't have the legal framework, it doesn't have the staff, and it doesn't have the public response, because there's been really, beginning in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, this drumbeat that our problem is government, and that not seeing government as a tool of social protection. So in government public health, we lost something like 50,000 positions over the years that followed. And I'm sure that other people on the panel can talk about ways in which things simply got worse. Now, we got a glimpse of how government can take really transformative action during COVID, which David has summarized, and Keisha and Lauren have all talked about. We saw the coffers open. I mean, the American, the first one, the CARES Act, I think it was it was trillions of dollars that none of us have felt particularly harmed by, but which saved many people and took people out of poverty, many of them children. But all that's been rolled back. So I think, the inequities that have been with us since this country was founded government is the culpable and capable partner, as Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen often point out. But if we weaken government, as we have done for decades, we don't have the tools at our disposal. So I really think that we can't talk about addressing structural racism without talking about a government that's able to take action.
Mary, you are so right on that. And also thinking about Sandy, people often say, you can't just throw money at the problem. And what we found is that if you throw money out the problem, people will stop being poor. Sometimes you can throw money at the
Yeah.
problem. You just have to be targeted with how you use those resources, and having, as you said, Mary, well-funded sources really does make a difference.
Yeah.
Eviction moratorium, expanded child health insurance, Operation Warp Speed that you mentioned in your paper, Mary.
Yeah.
HIV prevention.
Ironically, right? That was under Trump.
Of course, absolutely. HIV Prevention Trials Network, which segued amazingly to COVID and then to Mpox. I mean, these are really great examples. I want to just give Lauren, Michelle, and David the chance for any brief responses to the question.
Yeah, I'll just say, when it comes to government funding, Mary, I often think about the overfunding of carceral facilities, right? And so
Yes, that's right.
funding in the right way.
That was a social transformation, but not in a good way.
Exactly. Yeah. And so disinvestment from harmful systems into public health, public good oriented systems. And I think, it's so clear in the context of COVID, all the wrong things that jails and prisons did. And I think sometimes what's not talked about enough is that public health systems often think of themselves as very separate from carceral systems. And they think of carceral populations as not within their purview. And I think what COVID showed is that there has to be more of public health actors at the table deciding what happens in jails and prisons, and making sure that there is this clear understanding that the health of people who are incarcerated impacts the community too, and that all of the people who are incarcerated will eventually leave and they are community members. And so really thinking about this intersection of public health and carceral health as integral to the well-being of the community in general.
Prison health is public health, goes the mantra.
Yeah.
David?
Yes, I don't want to be the stinker at the party, or at least maybe I'll just be the cynic, but it's worth noting that for all the funding that was put in to improve the safety net and really bring up the bottom, far more money went to corporations and the wealthy.
Right.
And maybe that's the deal that we always have to make in the United States. It's unfortunate, but if you look at some of the new tax bills being considered, which would maintain the child tax credit, again, that gives far more tax cuts to corporations and to the wealthy than goes to people who really are needing that. So I think we have to have that discussion as well.
Right.
And Michelle?
Well, I'll just point out that what I really like about your pre-existing conditions framing is that pre-existing conditions are things that people, insurers, refuse to pay for when crises erupt. That's the nature of a pre-existing condition. We've rooted it out of our insurance system, but it's very much still in play here. And to me, it really just comes down to money. It's just such a pattern that we see over and over, as you well know, that as soon as one public health crisis fades, the funding is retracted and devoted either to the next health crisis, like in Zika virus, or to something else. And being around young people, I have hope that spending money to address structural inequality and wealth inequality will happen, but I don't think it will happen because of work of my generation of leaders. I think that is a long-term shift that there's not sufficient appetite for among the powerful at this point in time. But the other thing I'll add is just that I think public health works best when it does its work quietly, when it's just quietly excellent and it works in the background. My mentor, David Hemingway, has a wonderful book called While You Were Sleeping, which is all about great public health stories that happen without a lot of fanfare. And there actually are some really promising initiatives underway quietly under the radar screen that build on the successes of COVID. And you've mentioned a couple of those. Another that I've been involved in is continuing and expanding our wastewater surveillance system. There's a great deal of interest in that, very much equity driven. And so I think, I guess one thing I am optimistic about is that we can continue to do things that do require modest investments that have shown that they can have big payoffs and that can be done without poking the bear of public backlash.
Thanks, Michelle. That reminds me, there's a new PBS series. I haven't started watching it yet. It's called The Invisible Shield. I think Bloomberg helped to fund it. 13 parts. Public health saved your life today, and you don't even know it. And it's about that whole point that Michelle was talking about. I'll take a question from the room this time. Yes.
Yeah, I'm really interested in looking at worker safety and thinking beyond what the federal OSHA was not able to do or was not doing. Looking at wondering if you have examples of states. I'm thinking particularly of Cal OSHA and Los Angeles County, and thinking about whether there's a place for local government. I know in those locations it was required for employers to notify workers who were exposed to COVID-19 as opposed to many other states and localities. But I'm wondering if you see any promise in policies that could work at the state or local level.
That's a great question. Did you hear that okay, David?
Yes, I did. It is a great question. And, we have this sort of odd mosaic of OSHA coverage in the United States, where there are 21 states and some territories that have state OSHA programs that have the ability to go beyond federal OSHA. Some of them don't get that far, but California, Oregon, Washington have in some ways much better programs and are able to issue their own standards and have done really useful things. And it's very hard to study the effectiveness because we collect so little data, but it's pretty clear that local OSHAs can do more. But more importantly, I think that you raise local health departments. There's no reason that local health departments can't get involved in ensuring workplace safety. In some places in the Midwest, for example, local health departments tried to intervene in meatpacking plants where there were clearly big outbreaks, and the governors, who were very tied to some of the big meat companies, stopped them. But they don't need to be stopped. In fact, I think it makes a lot of sense to involve them. The problem has been, I think, that for the last 50 years, there's been this huge bifurcation that local health departments that are so underfunded have sort of said, well, there's OSHA. We don't need to do this. They don't have the expertise. They don't really know how to get into workplaces. But this is something that we should definitely be thinking about. And actually, the American Journal of Public Health piece that I referred to at the end of my talk actually begins to address this very issue, saying we need to then remerge these occupational health and mainstream public health, because I think we could be much more effective.
Thanks, David. Probably got time for one or two quick questions. Let's go online.
Yeah, so mentioned in all of the papers are two simultaneous things that happened during COVID. You had Trump advocating injecting bleach as a method. Wow.
Shouldn't laugh. Sorry, I can't help myself. Yes.
While you had public health leaders being vilified. So for the next pandemic,
Yes.
how do we plan for this?
Oh my God, Bleachgate and the risks of being in public health, vilification, threats, death threats. I mean, many of us have had those sorts of things. How do we deal with, I don't know what we want to call it, the politicization and the vilification of public health? Maybe I'll turn to you, Mary.
I wish I had an answer. The Kaiser Family Foundation was tracking the numbers of public health leaders in government public health who either resigned or were fired or otherwise left their jobs, and it was in the hundreds. So this was a real issue, and not one that I faced in New York State. New York State is a bit different. But in California, for example, the LA County Health Commissioner had a security detail throughout the pandemic and probably may have it still. So I just don't know what public health needs is political support. So we've talked about how we need public health to look at carceral settings. We need public health to look at workplaces. And the fact is the political support to do that work is often not there. In fact, public health is barred from those settings by the political leadership. And all I can say is elections really matter. And that we need to be mindful of our political leadership, because the hostility to government action that is framed as curtailing personal freedom is probably not going to go away. But it's not really about masks or vaccines. It's about something bigger than that. So that's where I worry, Michelle, about your argument of quietness, because some of this has to be addressed. our unionized workforce is now just a tiny fraction of the workforce outside of government, for example. So it's really important, I think, that we in academia lend our voice to protect public health workers who work for government structures and to advocate for the extension of the public health mandate.
Thanks, Mary.
With legal protections, but I don't know how to make that happen. Just everybody should be sure they're registered and they vote.
Yes, and look up Project 2025. I don't want to get partisan, but just look that up. I want to give just the last 2 minutes a minute to Jocelyn and a minute to Anna to just any final reflections, closing comments. Jocelyn.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's just so, again, so wonderful to have had all of you contribute to this important series, and equally to have been able to see your faces, put faces to names, but also hear you so eloquently discuss what are very deep and important set of analyses. You know, all these papers were commissioned from thought leaders and experts across America. They were peer-reviewed and editorially reviewed to death. The authors did an outstanding job reacting to the comments from their peers, including editors. And what you see here is a very, I think, polished and important piece of work. But what we really want to see, and I think what's been reflected in this discussion, is how evidence-based scientific health analysis can be used as a tool for action in health and as a tool for accountability in health. And that is what we hope that we have been able to offer by using the platform of the BMJ. And what I have great confidence in hearing all of you talk today, is that there is information and analysis and documentation in these papers that we can use to go forward to create more progressive change in health. And that is our only hope, that the work is there, it's documented, it's a part of the scientific record, but it should be used in the hands of not just academics, but as Mary has just said, public officials, members of the public who wish to vote. This information can be used for action and accountability. And again, thank you all.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I'm going to give the final word to me, Anna.
Gracias, Gavin. So 3 quick things. I think this has been fantastic. I encourage everybody to read the papers because they're very rich. I have three quick things I want to say. First of all, I want to give a shout out and call out all the public health leaders in the United States who did such a fantastic job despite all the odds in making very difficult decisions in a changing landscape. I feel very fortunate to have lived in Philadelphia, where I really felt that we were being protected as much as they could by the health department. So I'm very grateful to that, and I think we need to call them out. Second is, I think it's so important to keep this conversation going. I think, as many of you noted, COVID opened up a door in some ways, and I think we have to put our foot in it and not let it close. To keep this conversation going, and perhaps most importantly, to connect this to the bigger health issues that the US is facing today. Declines in life expectancy, dramatic health inequities, and to see if we can, despite the backlash, despite the scaling back of things, if we can keep this momentum to change things that we have created for ourselves and which are under our power to really change how we're organized socially, economically, everything. So I hope we will keep this going. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks so much. So thank you to Mary Bassett, David Michaels, Michelle Mello, Lauren Brinkley, Rubenstein, Jocelyn Clark, Ana Diez Roux, and Keisha Bentley-Edwards. The biggest panel, I think, and I would say maybe the best panel that we've ever had. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And it's lovely to see you.